morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar, Leading Through Crises and Beyond, Lessons from a Military Veteran. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shelson. I'm the president of 44 North Digital Marketing, and today I'm honored to have Mark Gasparotto from the Gasparotto Group participating with us in this webinar. Now, before we kick in, how this morning's session will look, we are going to start off with a recap of the answers we saw in the poll questions we had during the registration. It's going to be some back and forth between Mark and myself, and I know that the content that Mark's going to go through is absolutely fantastic. It's going to be great. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, I would encourage you to ask those questions in the Q&A session of the webinar. And then just be aware that we are going to issue some polls throughout the webinar. So please participate. We're looking forward to seeing your answers and seeing if Mark can give us some feedback on what that looks like. Okay, so let me introduce Mark. Mark Gasparotto is the president of the Gasparotto Group, which is a boutique firm that provides clients with leadership solutions through consulting, keynote, leadership development programs, and outside the wire experiential learning adventures. For those of you who don't know, I spent 13 years in the Canadian Forces. We've actually taken our team on Mark's Outside the Wire program 3 years in a row. And I can tell you firsthand that it has been absolutely transformational in the way that we do business and the way that our team works together. And I think that's really what got this webinar started, was Mark and I were talking, and I thought all of the lessons that we've learned from Outside the Wire are things that I need to get out to the folks in my network. And it's great to have everybody here. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, if you've been following Mark, you'll notice that his team has released a series of blogs entitled Survival Tent Routine that provide practical tips for families on how to survive and thrive during the crisis. During Mark's 20-year career of military service, having retired as a colonel in the Canadian Army as a combat engineer, Mark commanded small tactical teams to large multinational peacekeeping operations. Mark deployed to Bosnia, Kabul, Kandahar, and Haiti, where he was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal not once, but twice, as well as the Brazilian Army Medal. Upon his return from Kandahar, Afghanistan, back in 2006, Mark, along with 12 of his former officers and soldiers, wrote a book entitled Clearing the Way, Combat Engineers in Kandahar, which was then turned into an award-winning documentary film, which was actually aired here at the Forest City Film Festival in London, Ontario. If you are trying to get an idea of what Afghanistan was like and what the combat engineers did, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of his book and to check out the documentary, which can be found online. Mark is a licensed professional engineer. He holds a Master's of Defense Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada and a Master's of Arts in Leadership from Royal Roads University. Mark currently lives in Ottawa with his wife Shannon and two daughters, Abigail and Emily. And to stay fit, Mark backpacks in the summer, cross-country skis, and he said, quote unquote, attempts CrossFit year round. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today, Mark Gasparotto. Mark, it is a pleasure to have you. I can't wait to dive into your presentation.
Well, Corey, thank you very much for the introduction, and as always, grateful for the opportunity to collaborate. Ladies and gentlemen, wonderful to be connected with all of you on this virtual presentation. I'll now share my screen with you and bring up the registration poll results. So just give me a moment or two to do that. So poll number one, and this is the poll you would have answered as part of your registration, and it asked you the question, what is the greatest leadership challenge you are facing right now? And we had 30 some odd answers, and they really could be grouped into these four themes, excuse me. And about 75% of all answers are in these four themes. And the first theme, which was by far the most selected, was motivation and engagement. And that was also from two perspectives, personal motivation and also how to engage the team based on remote work and the COVID protocols. Other words used to describe this phenomenon were how to raise morale and how to inspire confidence in the team. The second theme is around adaptation, and there was some nuance here. For some, this was about external adaptation to the market, so your business models and delivery models. And for some, this was about internal adaptation in terms of processes and structures. The third theme was around focus and prioritization. So here, some mix as well. Some of that was your own focus. Some of that was keeping teammates on focus, but then also how to prioritize all the things you need to do in a crisis, both over the short and long term. And the last major theme was remote work. And that's really linked to all the three bullet points above. How do you maintain a focus now that you're remote if you weren't used to doing that before? How do you adapt based on this very real requirement to work remotely, etc.? So in my experience, these are very common issues. And in speaking with my clients, these are issues that most of them are facing. So I would say, if there's any comfort, you are not alone. So undoubtedly, we are in unprecedented times, uncharted territory, and there is massive disruption, low visibility, and high uncertainty. And people are tired, and people are anxious. They're fearful for their livelihoods, certainly, and in some cases, they're fearful for their lives. And confidence is shaky at best, and it is absent at worst. And the first time that I felt all of these emotions was not COVID. It was, in fact, September 2006 when I deployed to Kandahar, Afghanistan. I was a major in the Canadian Army at the time, and I was commanding a 135-strong squadron of combat engineers and other specialists. And we were part of a larger Canadian battle group of approximately 1,300 soldiers. And our role as combat engineers was to allow friendly forces to live, move, and fight on the battlefield, and to deny the same to the enemy, in this case, the Taliban. And our tour of duty coincided with Operation Medusa. And Operation Medusa was Canada's largest combat operation since the Korean War. And at the time, it was NATO's largest combat operation in its history. And the initial assault on the Taliban main defensive area known as Objective Rugby occurred on the 3rd of September 2006. And that attack was unsuccessful. And 4 Canadian soldiers were killed, including one of my own. This is a picture of the ramp ceremony where Sergeant Shane Stashnik's comrades carry his remains into the back of a plane that will transport him home for the last time. But 1 death, 4 deaths, 10 deaths did not stop us in terms of what we needed to do for the mission. So the next day, as we were preparing to reassault Objective Rugby, our position was strafed by a coalition warplane. And that friendly fire incident killed 1 soldier and wounded 35 others, including 5 from my squadron. This is a picture of me at that location, so I was there that day. And it marked the 3rd time that I had nearly been killed. And I would go on to lose in total 6 of my 9 lives in Kandahar. This is a picture of that friendly fire-caused mass casualty situation. You see many soldiers performing first aid on their buddies as we await for the helicopters to arrive to evacuate the wounded. And getting blown up in crisis, whether literally or figuratively, is not new for me. There are lessons from that experience in Kandahar. There are lessons from this experience that we are all going through presently, if only we choose to learn from them. I'll come back to this story a little later on after we go through some frameworks related to crisis and change leadership. This is my crisis leadership framework. It has 3 generic stages: the before, the during, and after a crisis. So starting on the left and moving right, stage 1 is about planning contingencies, what you do before crisis hits. And this is about identifying future scenarios and then preparing for and rehearsing your response. Stage 2, crisis response, and this has 3 steps. I'll go through each step. Step 1 is mobilize, and this encompasses all the immediate actions required to address the initial disruption. This is about rapidly orienting to the changing environment and making quick decisions of what to do. And so a triage occurs in terms of what activities to stop, what activities to start, and which ones will continue. This then moves into the stabilize step. And so this is the interim normal after people have managed to catch their breath. And here they're doing an initial stock taking of those rapid decisions, that triage in terms of stopped, started, and continued. And new processes and structures are reinforced. And if you had to deploy or employ any backups, backup plans, or backup resources during the mobilize step, here is where they are reconstituted. So you're making new backups going forward. Into step 3, which is strategize. And hopefully this is where most organizations currently are operating in, although I acknowledge that some may not be yet. And in strategize, you're still in this interim reality, like we are now in COVID. And this is where leaders start to think about how to capitalize on changes in the market or the environment, changes to their own organization, and changes to their perspective. So what adaptations born of the crisis are temporary and which ones to deliberately keep? That is the question that you as leaders should all be asking yourself right now. What adaptations born of this crisis are temporary and which ones will you deliberately keep? And that strategizing sets you up for stage 3. It's a great segue into transitioning forward. And after a significant crisis, rarely can you go back to normal. This is about adapting to the new environment. You've probably heard the term the new normal or the next normal. We don't know exactly what it'll look like, but how are we setting up to transition into it? So having introduced you to the crisis leadership framework, let's now roll in to our second poll. And the question is, at what stage is your organization in the crisis leadership framework that I just showed? And so here's the framework again. And here's the scale. It's from 1 to 10, and it needs some explanation. So it doesn't include stage 1. It goes from stage 2, mobilize, through stabilize, strategize, into stage 3. So for example, if your organization is still in mobilize, then you would select 1, 2, or 3 on the poll, depending on how far along you are in that step. You do the same for stabilize, 4 through 6, strategize, 7 through 9. And if your organization is in stage 3, transitioning forward, then select 10. So Corey, please go ahead and launch the poll.
Okay, everybody, so I've launched the poll. You should see it pop up on your screen. And if you could take a moment now to answer the question based on Mark's matrix, that would be great. I'm gonna end the poll and I'm gonna share the results. So Mark, having a look at this, I mean, I see a pretty wide spread. It doesn't look like anybody's in the scale 1, 2, so the initial mobilizing steps, which doesn't really surprise me given the fact that we're about 9 weeks into the pandemic. And I know most folks in this audience, there are some, fantastic business leaders that are on this call. So it doesn't surprise me that people have moved through the spectrum. What would you say in terms of why we see this spread? Why are we seeing some people more, we see a lot of people in stage 6. So stabilization, kind of moving into strategize. And then we have some folks that have moved already into transitioning forward. What are the causes for that?
Yeah, I don't think this is atypical in terms of a spread. And I think generally speaking, it depends on how well those organizations can get over the barriers to change. And we're going to look at some barriers to change a little later on. And I think it also would depend on the level of preparedness they had for a crisis. So you mentioned you didn't have a pandemic response. I know certainly in the Army, the Canadian Forces has a pandemic specific contingency plan. But did companies go through any kind of contingency planning, and what was their business continuity setup? And I think for COVID, the original business model and delivery model also played a significant part because of the specifics of what happened. So if you were already set up to work remotely and you delivered digital services or your services digitally, then you had a head start. So I think, Corey, this would be a great example or a great way for you to walk through what 44 North did specifically. I know you touched on it initially to give people a sense of the different stages and what that looked like specifically for 44 North.
So when I take a look at this, Mark, I mean, stage one, planning contingencies, we didn't have a pandemic response plan, and I'm not sure many organizations did. Some governments didn't. So we didn't have anything. But I think we had some systems in place by the virtue of the way we do business that allowed us to move through stage two quite easily. Number one, we work remotely. We have staff that work in different areas of Ontario, and we have two offices, one in London and one in Barrie. So the remote work part came quite easy to us. When I take a look at your model, look at mobilize, in terms of immediate actions, I think the immediate actions for us occurred over a period of about 48 to 72 hours. March 13th, I recall, is the date that we decided to have our team go remote. And in the 2 or 3 days after we went remote, there was some heavy planning on Jackie and my part. And we tried to reach out to as many clients as we could to get feedback on what was going on and just put immediate actions in place that we would need to stabilize the business, which then transitioned us into your next part, which really we looked at our processes and our systems that we needed in order to stabilize the business and make sure that we could continue providing uninterrupted level of service to our clients. But during that stabilization period is where we saw the impacts to some of our staff, specifically in the remote working capacity. In fact, we had one staff member that had to go on leave because she just simply couldn't work. So that stabilization period of, what staff is this going to work for, which is it not, and how are we going to change the way we do business to try and make this as best as we can. And there was a couple things we did then that really helped. One is we mandated 45-minute shutdowns every day from 11:45 to 12:30. And the idea here was we saw through the first few weeks of the pandemic that staff were really being overwhelmed by working from home, having their kids biting at their ankles, managing the stress of the whole thing. And we determined that if we can force the staff to shut down for 45 minutes every single day and go spend time with their family, take a break, go for a walk, get some exercise, we thought it would help, and it really has. The other thing that we did was we institutionalized 2-day-a-week yoga. So Wednesday mornings and Friday morning yoga at 7:30, led by Jackie. And then also Friday afternoon social time where we would, beers or wine or juice, whatever people wanted to drink. 4 o'clock on Fridays, we do it. And I think those few things that we've tried to do have really helped our team come together and stabilize in this new normal. And then in terms of strategize and transitioning forward, I'd say that's where we are right now, right? What are we going to do moving forward to continue serving our customers as best we can? So that's kind of how it's worked for us. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it paints a picture in terms of how you go through, how you move through these stages. And I look forward to the conversations we're going to have over the next couple of weeks in terms of that strategizing around which adaptations, again, born of this crisis, will you deliberately keep? And what does that mean in terms of integrating that into your new standard operating procedures? And I think that's a very exciting place to be. So that's great. And I think this is that example is a good segue to move into the next segment of the presentation where we talk about change initiatives. So change initiatives, moving successfully from stage 2, so that response to the crisis, to stage 3, that transitioning forward, it means change. And often, and certainly with COVID, I think it means transformational change. And based on research from both Forbes and McKinsey, the failure rate for organizational change initiatives is 70%. In fact, only 25% of change initiatives demonstrate any sustainable gains over time. Those are very poor odds. So why do 70% of change initiatives fail? Well, I want to walk you through some of the reasons. It's a busy slide, but these are the 7 stages of grief. And this is called the Kubler-Ross model. And originally there were 5 stages, and the ones with an asterisk were added later. And the stages are shock, then denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and acceptance. And so, full transparency, not everyone likes this model. It's been shown that not everyone feels every emotion. Sometimes multiple emotions occur at once. Sometimes they're out of order. Sometimes there's a loop. And sometimes you never get to acceptance. However, I believe this is a good model to portray the emotions associated with change. And why is that? Well, there is grieving with change, especially when change is imposed. So for all the bosses in the audience, I need you to realize that you will experience change differently from your employees. The less discretion you have in terms of how you react to change makes it more imposed. And that creates a greater shock. So when change is imposed, you have no discretion on how you react to it. It is a tremendous shock. And that means it could take you longer to get through these stages. And I'm happy to explore that in greater detail during the Q&A. Well, the key for all of us in terms of the stages of change is to move as quickly as possible from shock to testing. And testing equates to experimentation, learning from small trials, both successful and unsuccessful. And testing, it propels adaptation, and ultimately it propels a change in mindset and acceptance of the new reality. So mindset, it's hard to change. A lot of it is ingrained, but a useful way to help change your mindset is by reframing the questions that you ask. So reframing. If you recall the 3 steps to crisis response, you see them on the screen: mobilize, stabilize, and strategize. For people who are still in the stages of grief in terms of shock and denial, anger, bargaining, and depression, here are examples of how they may frame their situation. They'll ask questions like, am I going to survive? What is the minimum I need to operate? So who do I furlough or lay off or fire to cut costs immediately? And how long will this last? So if I could just hold my breath long enough, can I hold it until we get back to normal? So there's a past orientation there. And moving through the testing and acceptance stage requires a reframing of those questions to something like this. What are my next steps for a turnaround? So my next steps. What must we do now to keep future capacity? So again, this is an internal thing. So we keep the people that when things get better, we've got the capacity to transition forward. And what must we do to thrive in this new context? So again, what must we do to thrive? So how are you framing the questions that you ask yourself and of others to better understand the environment and to set up action? So let's get into another framework now, but this one will become more personal as we look at 4 different change leadership styles. So this is a simple framework, and it's drawn from Psychometrics. It's the company in Canada that does all the Myers-Briggs assessments. And it's based on two leadership style dichotomies or opposites. So portrayed horizontally is the task and people dichotomy. And the task and people continuum, that's found in most leadership frameworks. And this is a focus. So when you've got something to do you focus on the task at hand, or do you focus on how people will do it and how they're impacted by it? And the second axis there, north-south, is between flexibility and planfulness. And this is in terms of how people approach getting work done. So here are the 4 icons to represent those 4 change leadership styles. And we're going to look at each one in turn. And as we do that, I want you to please pay attention to the benefits and the drawbacks of each. We're going to go through that. And I want you to relate these benefits and drawbacks of each style to your own behaviors, because we're going to conduct another poll where you will get to indicate your predominant change leadership style. And hopefully there's a great cross-section there that will drive some good commentary between Corey and myself. So the first style, it combines a focus on task and plan. And so here are some of the benefits. These folks are super organized with lists and timelines, and they can integrate plans and people and resources. They are action-oriented, meaning they will make rapid decisions. And they are headstrong. They have very clear positions, so there is little ambiguity. You know exactly where you stand. Some potential drawbacks with this style. These folks are often unilateral, so they will not solicit input from others or regularly do so. And they lack empathy, so they have issues with their emotional intelligence. And I would say, if I had the time to tell you my entire story of Kandahar, I struggled with a lack of empathy and how I would relate to troops. And when you lack empathy, you're often unaware of your impact and your leadership wake. The next style combines a focus on task and flexibility. Here are the benefits. People with this style are big picture, they're visionary. They empower folks to get work done. They encourage that diversity, and so they are highly adaptive and inclusive. Some drawbacks. They can be vague in terms of their direction and details. And they can be indecisive at times, trying to find the perfect answer for something. The third style, combining people and planfulness. Some benefits. These folks are integrators. They connect vision with mission and values. They're highly inclusive, so they drive collaboration. And because they're great connectors, they build harmony and consensus building. Some drawbacks. People with this style are often conflict averse, and that poses problems for holding others accountable. And they'll avoid some hard decisions because of it. And what happens as a result is they can often become overwhelmed and overtaxed because they don't force other people to do the work and they take it all on themselves. And the last style, people combine an orientation towards people and flexibility. And here are the benefits. These folks develop others with a passion. They're great coaches and mentors. They gather lots of information, so they're curious, they investigate, and they have high energy and are optimistic. They're energized by change. Some drawbacks. They're inconsistent. They're all over the place, and that causes problems in terms of added confusion. And they have an inattention to detail, and that impacts how well tasks are accomplished if that requires a great amount of process. So those are the 4 styles. What we'll do now is we'll roll into poll number 3. And the question is, what is your predominant change leadership style. So Corey, over to you to launch the poll, please.
I love the framework. And again, if everybody could just take a moment and, where do you fit on this map? And we'll see where the consensus lies in terms of the group that's here today. Mark, I wish I could be good at everything and not bad at other stuff. I think that all of us wish we could have only the pros of each of them and none of the bad things. So we'll see how people self-identify.
Yeah, well, we can pull on that thread when the poll numbers come in and have a discussion around that.
Okay, we're going to end the poll there, and I will share the results. Very interesting. It's almost an even split between all of them. Task and plan seems to be the winner. And it's interesting. If I were to look at my own style, I would say that I am a task plan person. When I think about the pros for me and our team, I would say I would consider myself highly organized, action oriented. I try to take the guesswork out of things. So I can clearly lay out what our team needs to do and we can go get it done. And it allows us to move very rapidly and get a lot done very efficiently. But I do know that when I'm doing that, I can, I think if someone was to burn somebody out on our team, if there was to be burnout, it would probably be attributed to my style. Sometimes decisions may be made unilaterally if we don't have the time to get everybody's buy-in. And perhaps I could be perceived the same way as not having being 100% on the empathy scale. But like I said, and I think we're all probably feeling the same thing, I wish I could only be the good stuff of all four of these leadership or change management styles. Do you have any thoughts about that, Mark? And maybe we could circle back to that component of this, because how could somebody possibly be only the good stuff?
Well, I'll answer that question, and then I'll show you some statistics that relate to this globally. Well, I think it's hard to be all the good and none of the bad. And it's hard, especially in crisis, because in crisis, people are under stress. And when people are under stress, they revert to type, which means their base personality, their base instincts. And that can be overcome, but it takes a high degree of self-awareness and self-control. And I would say a lot of what I do with coaching clients revolves around that self-awareness, wanting to become a better leader. So where it can become helpful is to have diversity of thought and personality on the team. You already mentioned how that dynamic has changed between yourself and Jackie by bringing her on. So when you have this yin and yang, where you can cover off on those strengths and mitigate those weaknesses or those drawbacks, you got to build that relationship in terms of that senior team, and then that should exist throughout the organization. I think that is the best way to have that balance.
Yeah, on that point there, Mark, I mean, when I hired Jackie, for those of you who don't know her, she's our VP of Operations and Strategy. She basically runs the day-to-day operations so that I can focus on building the business. And we interviewed probably for 1.5 years for that position. And it was so hard to find the yin to my yang. Somebody who could appreciate the pros of my personality and then with their personality kind of counter my cons and vice versa. And I'm very, very lucky to have her, because as you were talking, that's the first thing I thought was, I think I solved it with my Jackie.
This is not part of the talk, so a bit of a tangent, but every organization needs 3 roles. They need a visionary, they need an integrator, and they need a disciplinarian. And so who takes on those roles and how it shifts back and forth depending on where you are, either in the business cycle or even in the project cycle. There's some interesting dynamics there. But again, it's the interplay between the personalities on a team that makes a big difference in terms of how you respond to crisis, but also how well a change will stick. So let me bring up another slide. These statistics come from psychometrics. So again, if you've done your Myers-Briggs typology assessment, so personality test, this is globally. These numbers pertain to corporate leadership in terms of the manager level up to the CEO. And you can see there's a very clear imbalance from left to right in terms of the focus on task versus the focus on people. 76% to 24%. Not nearly as imbalanced in terms of our audience, which had a 56% to 44%. So a lot better balance there. But this is worldwide, 76% task, 24% for people. So if we go back to that other statistic where 70% of change initiatives fail, and they fail predominantly due to inadequate leadership. And the 25% that do succeed with sustainable results do so because leadership addressed both the task and the people side of the equation. So let me put that into perspective by returning to my story in Kandahar. And where I last left you on the 4th of September, we had just been hit by friendly fire. And our environment, it changed in an instant. It changed in the millisecond it took for those high explosive rounds to leave that airplane and explode on the ground. And the casualties, death, and destruction of the previous 48 hours, it had rendered our initial plan obsolete. And while we didn't know it in the moment, because you never do, those 2 days of deaths and casualties represented the low point of our tour. And it's in the darkest times that leadership matters the most. And to lead others effectively, it starts with leading yourself. And on the 4th of September 2006, I found myself pulled by conflicting forces. On one hand, I had to be shrewdly realistic about how I made sense of a rapidly changing and violent battlefield. And on the other, as Napoleon put it, I had to be a dealer in hope. A dealer in hope to bolster the morale and fighting spirit of my troops, regardless of how grim the situation. So I had to be two things at once, two opposite things at once. I had to be concerned with both task and people in the extreme. And I would tell you, it is that paradox that is so often the burden of leadership, especially so in crisis. So what did we do? Well, we mobilized immediately to treat the wounded and prevent a Taliban counterattack. We stabilized the battlefield to buy 48 hours of time to strategize and to reset. We then tested an idea and transitioned forward to regain the initiative. So what was that idea? Well, it was a crazy idea. We went out and rented civilian patterned yellow bulldozers from a construction company and then welded on steel plating to the cab. And the troops called this Mad Max in reference to that Mel Gibson movie. Well, I can tell you that the contractor had no idea what we were doing with his dozers. And that made for a very interesting conversation when he finally found out. And I know you're laughing, Corey. I usually get people in complete shock hearing this story. So I think, you get it as a soldier and having been there. But there are many leadership lessons pertaining to the Mad Maxing of dozers. But the two lessons that I want to focus on link back to some of the frameworks. So the 7 stages of grief and the one we just talked about in terms of task versus people. So number 1, acceptance. There can be no real ownership and accountability until you can accept your circumstances. And the situation may take away many of your choices. However, as Viktor Frankl wrote, in A Man's Search for Meaning, a book about surviving the Nazi Holocaust, he said, "Everything can be taken from a person, but one last thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." So with COVID, with anything, you choose how you will ultimately react. And the second lesson related to the dozers is the people side of the leadership equation. My operators did not like this plan. It put them at extreme risk. And what I try to do whenever we're doing something crazy or different is I try to explain the why. I take a great amount of time and effort to explain the why. It isn't always possible, right? When we're being ambushed, there's no time to explain to a soldier why you decided to go right or left. But when you do have the time to explain it, it is well worth it. So why was I putting them at risk in this example? There were roads where we were operating, but if we drove down that road, there was a 100% guaranteed chance someone was going to hit a roadside bomb or an improvised explosive device. So as engineers, we took some risk with these dozers to create our own roads to lessen it for others. And so I had to explain that to my troops. And I think I could also relate to their fears. I was sharing similar risks to my life by leading from the front. And I could empathize with them as best I could, although I think that's been an area for tremendous development on my end. But I could look them in the eye and say, I know you're scared. I'm scared. But I need you to do this for all the reasons I've explained, and I'm with you. And we're mitigating the risks as best we can. And we will fight to the finish line together. And that is how I convinced them to Mad Max those dozers. So the finish line. Well, in a place like Afghanistan, there is no ultimate finish line, but that's a story for another day. However, for Operation Medusa, there was a finish line, and you see it here in this photo. This is one of my rented bulldozers having cleared the way to Objective Rugby. The objective was secured and the operation declared a success. Now, if you fast forward about 6 months, this is a paved road in an area that was just a war zone. So we transitioned forward from heavy war fighting to construction because that is what the situation called for. And we adapted by going through the stages of crisis leadership and pouring our efforts into looking after both the task and our people.
So Mark, I just want to connect the dots here. I mean, I have heard your story a number of times. I've been personally on the ground in some of these areas, and volatile to say the least. When we look at what you did with Mad Maxing that bulldozer, you know, I just want to try and connect the dots to what people might be experiencing here in Canada right now. I think about innovation. You know, I think about the fact that you took what you had. You had access to civilian D6 or D12 bulldozers. You had steel in the camp. And I think you inspired people by saying, hey, we're not going to just do the same thing as we did a week or two ago when people got hurt. We're going to do something else, and we're going to innovate, and we're going to inspire you to go into this situation with a new, radical, crazy idea. So how does that, you know, translate to today? Well, I mean, take a look at Mike Smith. For those of you who don't know who Mike Smith is, he's the owner of 4 restaurants here in London, Ontario. So Joe Cool's is one of them, the Runt Club. So here's a guy who employs, I don't know how many people employs. I'm going to guess over 100 people. He's got access to a supply chain of groceries, but his restaurants are boarded up. So what do? How do you take care of your people? How do you innovate? Well, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, and maybe many of you are, is he's opened something called Cool Group Groceries, where you can go online and you can order all of your groceries from Joe Cool's supply chain and have contactless delivery and pickup. And I see this innovation happening time and time again with businesses in terms of how they take the problem that they're in and then move through those stages of, and I don't want to screw this up, of mobilizing, stabilizing, and then strategizing how you take a bad situation and get to the other side to create a solution for it.
There's no question we are all startups again. And so revisiting from first principles what your value proposition is to clients. So it's not just about that internal adaptation to COVID and working remotely. It's where do you provide value in this new environment, and how are you pivoting towards that? Well, let's transition to the next part of the presentation, and I'll give you 5 takeaways that I think will help. And just to let you know, we're running about 12 to 15 minutes behind. So no doubt, well, certainly I'm good with it, Corey will be good with it, but the Q&A session that was intended for within the hour will spill over into your lunch. Takeaway number 1, control what you can control. This is the best way to keep your composure and sustainably execute during a crisis. In crisis, there's tremendous value in terms of maintaining those normal processes under stress. So keep doing the easy things easily so you save capacity, both physical, mental, emotional, resources, financial, etc., to deal with the novel, the exceptional, and the severe aspects of a crisis. Takeaway number 2, accountability and ownership. Strong leaders own their experiences. Strong leaders own their experiences, and they become better people for them. So it doesn't matter how you got here or if you were responsible for what is occurring. None of us started COVID. But that doesn't preclude us from owning the situation, owning the problem, owning the solution, and owning the outcomes, both good and bad. The next takeaway, personal resilience. And this involves the capacity to resist, recover from, and even thrive in the face of adversity. And resilience, it's not a static state. It's a process, and that process includes finding strength and meaning and connection between the body, mind, heart, and soul, or the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So here, think of a 4-legged table, and each one of those legs in the table corresponds to your body, mind, heart, and soul. And for a table to stand properly, the legs should be the same length. And that equates to you looking after all elements of your humanity. Because when we're under stress, what happens is pressure is put on our table. And if one of our legs isn't the same length as the others, we will tip over or fall. Next is structured 360-degree communications. And in a crisis, there's a very natural human tendency to want to turn inward, to isolate, to hunker down to withstand the effects of the storm. And certainly, I felt that way after the friendly fire incident. But to counter this, leaders at all levels need to ramp up communications with their team, and people need to over-communicate. So that doesn't mean drowning everyone in a constant flow of data. It means information should be structured and standardized in a way that everyone recognizes. It should be consolidated, and consolidated with a leader's assessment, because that assessment provides the context for understanding and action within the organization. And the last takeaway, teamwork based on trust. Trust being the #1 determinant of team effectiveness. So how do you create trust? Well, you as a leader must be willing to share vulnerability. And by doing so, you can create safe spaces for both the task and the people side of the leadership equation. So ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up the takeaways in the formal part of the webinar. We can now move into the Q&A session. So Corey, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So the first question we have here is from Charlie. And it's more of a comment mentioning that they have been doing a bi-weekly virtual pub quiz on Friday afternoons that has been fun and a way to bring some light relief into the day. So I guess my question for you is, A, what are you seeing with your clients? And what did you do back in 2006? You're in the middle of a very bad, very volatile situation when you finally had all the troops together and you had a chance to try and, I don't know, bring a bit of humanity back into a war zone and bring some social or some fun into it. You know, what did you do and what would you recommend for everybody?
So in terms of what I'm seeing clients do, some of them have gone with this virtual beer calls, virtual, connection. I've certainly advocated for people to reach out, especially those who may be alone and isolating alone at home, because loneliness, it is a real factor. So as leaders, are you reaching out to your people? I also know that people are, they've got Zoom fatigue and they don't really want another virtual gathering. So if you can space them out in a frequency that makes sense, I would suggest that. In terms of what I did in Kandahar, my squadron was together before Operation Medusa, and we were never together again until the very end of the tour, because we had people all over Kandahar province. So I, as the leader, would move around and do what we'd call battlefield circulation. I would speak to them daily on the radio, and if they weren't in radio range, maybe every couple of days via sat phone. So that's how we kept it up. And in the heavy fighting, I never kept troops out on the line fighting more than 30 days in a row. We'd want to get them back to the airfield for a rest and refit. So that's how I tried to balance all of those demands and also still foster that sense of team, of community within the squadron.
So in terms of here in Canada now, regular check-ins, even if you can't see people face to face, making sure you're staying in constant communication and letting them know that they're heard and they have a voice, like you're listening to them.
That's exactly it.
Next, how do you motivate someone who has been sitting on the couch for 8 weeks and now you need them to bring their A game to work?
Well, I'm going to infer by that they weren't doing work while at home. So I don't know the entire context. I think checking in and finding out where they are personally, right? So where are they in terms of those 7 stages of grief? And what do they need to become unstuck? So just listening to them, you will get a sense for their language. And are they externalizing the problem? Or are they internalizing it in terms of, are they willing to take control of it themselves? So I would engage in a coaching approach to see where they're at personally and also professionally.
What do you think is more important between the personal and professional side right now?
Well, if they're not motivated or if they're having issues around motivation, I would start on the personal side. And, people are working from home, or you could say they're sleeping in the office. There's all sorts of it. So, before, I know some supervisors didn't want to get involved in employees' personal lives. A, it wasn't their business. And, B, they didn't feel comfortable. And C, maybe they weren't even allowed in. But with COVID and people working from home, the boundaries are exceedingly blurred. And so I think you need to at least ask about it. Mm-hmm. So not pry, but ask and open up the conversation.
I know on our end, I found transparency seems to be one of the number one helpful things that I'm doing. Just try and be as transparent as I can around all things in the business. Let people know what we're doing, why we're doing it a certain way, so they can see more than just what they're working on day to day. Kathleen, it sounds like the testing phase is important. Testing involves failure. How do you encourage people to keep testing without getting a futile feeling?
Well, it's only failure if you fail to learn. So, in innovation circles, they talk about failing fast, failing forward. You don't know what's going to work. And so you got to test that. but you as a boss, are you providing the top cover for people to fail? So I'll use the dozer example. If that had failed tactically, right, it didn't work on the battlefield, I knew my boss, the battle group commander, he was not going to hold it against me personally. My career was not going to stop because I took a risk, right? So I felt personally safe to take professional risks. So how do you create that space? And there's a great book called The Culture Code. You know, Brene Brown talks about it as well, and its vulnerability. And it's a vulnerability loop. So you as the boss should demonstrate vulnerability first. And then you open up the space for someone else to then reciprocate. And when you have that back and forth of sharing a vulnerability, the deep bonds of trust can flourish. In fact, it's a prerequisite for building that. So what is failure? Are you doing an after-action review or a post-mortem or a retrospective? Are you really learning from it? But again, you know, that's sort of the process side. On the human side, what are you doing to encourage people? What's the language that you're using? And this is where that coaching approach can be so valuable.
Mark, Leon, I did see your question about wage subsidies. I'm not sure that Mark's going to have the answer to that one, but I can I'll follow up afterwards with what I'm hearing about it. Mark, before we transition for your key takeaways or for your wrap up, I want to just touch on something that everything you've said, I think, encapsulates, which is taking risk, how taking risk can lead to innovation in an organization, but then tying that back to, will people take risk, and when will people take risk as it relates to feeling safe and feeling like if they're going to take risk, they're not going to be fired if they screw up. You know, can you touch on that for a moment? Because I think that is one of the key things our team has taken away from all of your programming with Outside the Wire is we go there as a team of individuals, as a group of individuals, and we walk away as a team where everybody feels safe. And because they feel safe, they're willing to take risk. And if they take risk, then we as a company innovate.
Well, I think it starts with you as their leader or Jackie to create that culture. So I'll try not to rehash that vulnerability loop, but I'll give you an example of how I try to set that up. So in brainstorming or the ideation phase, I really try, I fail sometimes spectacularly, but I really try to speak last. I will maybe set the scene, but allow for the conversation to really diverge and not put too many boundaries on it unless, you know, those boundaries are crucial to the problem solving. But I take the exact opposite approach when I do an after action review. When we do a mission or a project, during the after action review, I will be the first one to stand up and I will start with all of my mistakes. Now, I'm known to be a pretty self-critical guy. So, you know, some of that is just my personality. But what I'm trying to do is make it okay to say, this was my part of the plan, right? This is how you inculcate accountability and responsibility and ownership, where it is okay to say, you know what? I effed that up. That was the impact of my mistake. And here are all the things I'm going to do so it doesn't happen again. And so those have been two very powerful, or what I consider to be powerful approaches to creating that safe place to take risks. And if you outline what people are authorized to do and the risks they can take within that envelope, well then, you know, from a structural or a process perspective, you've created that bubble for them to go and experiment.
I love it. I love it. Well, Mark, I know we're past time here. We don't have any other questions. Maybe I can hand it back over to you to just wrap up with any last words that you have prior to our very last poll.
Okay, great. So ladies and gentlemen, if you can just stay with us for another, I'd say 5 or 6 minutes, that'll allow us to go through. I'll just share my screen with you again. I'll do a little recap, and then we'll get into our exit polls. Testing and acceptance. That goes back to the 7 stages of grief. So how can you quickly move from shock to testing and acceptance as quickly as possible? And that's linked to reframing. Getting unstuck by reframing the questions you ask yourself and others. And reframing the question can change your mindset from this terrible thing is happening to me to this is what I'm going to do about it. So it's that external versus internal locus of control. Task and people. As a leader, you will need to be many different things at once. And often these responsibilities will pull you in polar opposite directions. Embrace the paradox and the conflict that comes with leadership, especially in crisis. Control what you can control. So focus and prioritize the essential elements of your crisis response and triage your activities into stop, start, and continue. Accountability. You may not be responsible for causing the problem. However, you must own the situation and your reactions to it and the outcomes. Resilience. Look after all 4 elements of your humanity. So the 4 legs of your table: body, mind, heart, and soul. Communications. Tell people the why and then consolidate knowledge to reduce information overload. And the last recap point is trust. It's the #1 determinant of team effectiveness. So build it, nurture it, and sustain it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, before I hand it back over to Corey to administer one last poll, my concluding remarks. Never waste a crisis. Use this pandemic as an opportunity to fully live into your ideals and fully live up to your potential to lead through crisis and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I know I can speak on behalf of everybody here that this was a remarkable presentation. I know that over the past few years since we've been working together, since you left the military, you've really helped my team in terms of trust, feeling safe, transparency, and the way that we do business. I'd like to remind everybody about Mark Gasparotto and the Gasparotto Group. I'd hardly encourage you to check them out in terms of if you have any needs on the leadership development side. Mark's been in and done a keynote for our company. We've had him in to do a number of coaching sessions, in-house working groups in terms of creating our company values, our company mission statement, the tenets that we do business that are our guiding North Star for everything that we do. All of our staff work with Mark and Mark's team for individual coaching calls that we do once per month. And this is an opportunity for both myself talking to Mark and for my team talking to his associates to have a professional individual to ask questions about what we're struggling with in terms of leadership, team dynamics, personal resilience, vulnerabilities, or things that we're not feeling great about from that soft stuff when it comes to work. And Mark's team has been absolutely fantastic in terms of how my team members have elevated their way of thinking. If you have capacity, I'd highly recommend you check out Mark's Outside the Wire program. Mark, I know you had one scheduled for the spring and you're looking to postpone it to the fall. There is the Canada-Ontario Job Grant, which is absolutely fantastic and can help cover some of the costs in taking that. Before we go, the one thing I would leave with everybody is that your success, everybody who's on this call, especially the clients of 44 North, your success is our success. If you succeed, then we are going to succeed. We want to make sure that you have the tools and the resources you need for your businesses to grow. And I'd like to return the favor to Mark. And to return the favor to Mark, what I'd like to do is ask everybody to answer the following questions in the poll. The first one is, what is your organization's greatest leadership challenge going forward when it comes to task and to people? And then last but not least, give us an idea of how this webinar has helped you. You graded yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 before the webinar. We'd love you to grade yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 after the webinar. And what we're going to do is we're going to share all of these answers with everybody when we send out the recording of this webinar. So once again, thank you to everybody for participating. I'm going to launch the poll now. I'd ask you to take a moment before you leave to please provide this feedback, as it will be great information for Mark and myself. And again, thank you for taking time out of your day to join us today. I look forward to crossing paths with each of you in days to come. Thanks again, Mark. Really appreciate your time today.
My deep pleasure.